City Club members, friends, guests, and community members, welcome. My name is Blair Garland, Senior Director of Community Relations and Marketing at OSU Cascades, which is City Club's community partner and education annual sponsor. And with today being the last City Club forum that I'll introduce, I've been honored to serve as the president of City Club's board over the course of this past year. It's truly been an honor. Today's forum is how do we improve the academic success of students experiencing houselessness? But before we begin, I have some acknowledgments to make. City Club would not be here without the generous support of many. And I'd like to give a shout out to our other annual sponsors. So please join me in thanking our platinum sponsors, St. Charles Health System and Brooks Resources, our gold sponsors, ASI Wealth Management, Pacific Source Health Plans, First Interstate Bank, and the Central Oregon Association of Realtors. Our partner in higher education and workforce development, COCC, and our silver sponsors, Ameriprise Financial, Kittleson and Associates, Miller Lumber, Mosaic Medical, the Lucier Center, and Transformation Systems International. And today's live stream is made possible by our partnership with Connect Central Oregon, a nonprofit launch with the assistance of the OSU Cascades Innovation Collab, where we're broadcasting from here today. Now, most of you already know Joey Drucker is retiring this month as the executive director of City Club after 10 years at the helm. Now, during that time, City Club has grown leaps and bounds in terms of membership, in terms of forum attendance, and most importantly, has really become the place in Central Oregon where all the important conversations happen. This is because of Joey's leadership and all the hard work of all of our volunteers and committees. Now, those of you who know Joey personally know that she doesn't really seek out the spotlight. Now, when you think of good leaders, we usually do think of someone who's right there at the center of attention, but really, the best leaders, and this is true of Joey's style, are often not in the spotlight because real leadership, and really the best kind of leadership, happens by working through other people. And that's exactly what Joey has done with City Club, and now we can see the incredible impact of her leadership and for the good of our community. And so now City Club is able to stand on Joey's shoulders as we forge ahead under the leadership of new Executive Director Kim Gammond. And lucky for us, Joey has agreed to continue on to help with forum management on a part-time basis. Joey, thank you tremendously for what you've done for City Club. Thank you for your continued help, and congratulations on an absolutely fantastic career. And one final note before moving on to the program. City Club members, today is the last day to vote on the new slate of board members, including the new board president and president-elect. Look in your email for information about how to cast your electronic ballot. Today's program is the first City Club partnership with the Bulletin. Last Sunday, Bulletin Special Projects reporter Zach DeMars featured our topic in the article, The Least Likely to Graduate. We plan to partner with the Bulletin throughout the year to take additional conversations further from investigative pieces they publish. Zach is with us here today to moderate our program. He returned to the Bulletin this summer after a year at Coos Bay World on the Oregon coast. And while Zach's from Washington, he's a graduate of the University of Oregon and interned at the Bulletin. He was a lead author on the book Classroom 15 and was on the Catalyst Journalism Project team investigating solutions to homelessness. That reporting appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Zach, I pass the microphone to you.
Thanks, Blair, and welcome to today's forum, everyone. The Bulletin is really proud to collaborate with the City Club to bring Central Oregon this conversation and the solutions workshop that we'll be hosting with local changemakers on November 4th. We've got a really excellent panel of speakers today who are going to share some really insightful thoughts about youth homelessness in our community, and in particular, the challenges our houseless students face in getting across the graduation stage. So to start, we'll introduce our panel here. Eliza Wilson is the program manager for Grandma's House, a division of J-Bar-J Youth Services that provides shelter for pregnant and parenting youth in Central Oregon. She herself experienced homelessness as a youth and is now a member of the executive board of Central Oregon's Homeless Leadership Coalition. Steve Wetherald is a special education teacher and graduation coach at Bend High School, and last May was named the 2022 Central Oregon Regional Teacher of the Year. And joining us virtually from Ashland today is Uriah Barzola. He is a freshman studying theater arts and maybe anthropology at Southern Oregon University. Barzola graduated from Bend High this spring. Hi, Uriah, and welcome. Now, while it's only one of the many ways that we as communities can measure a student's success, we do know that graduation rates and getting across the graduation stage is a really important metric for communities to pay attention to. Research shows that a high school diploma is the key for students to unlocking a living wage career in their futures. High school graduation is also a matter of slowing a cycle of future homelessness. A 2019 study, for example, showed that young adults without high school diplomas were 4.5 times more likely to be homeless than their peers who graduated. Now, in Oregon, students who experience any kind of homelessness, whether that's in a shelter, in tents, on the streets, doubled up, couch surfing, with family or unaccompanied for any period of time, graduate at the lowest rates of any demographic group that the Oregon Department of Education tracks. Statewide, let's take a look at those numbers. Statewide, just about 60% of that group graduates in 4 years. Those rates vary in Central Oregon school districts, from 56% in Bend-Lapine schools to 73% in Redmond schools. It is important to note that those rates do vary between schools, from school to school, even within districts, for a variety of reasons. But generally, they are consistently 10 to 15 percentage points lower than the rates of other students in the district and in the schools. There is some bright news. Those rates are increasing. They have been increasing in just the 4 years that the state has been tracking those rates. They've risen from 50 to 60% in the past 4 school years, and local rates have been trending upwards as well. Before we jump into our panel, I do just want to acknowledge, over the reporting that I've done the past several months, the deep complexity of this issue. The numbers, for example, that I just mentioned, those are 4-year graduation rates. More students graduate in 5 years, and even more students complete high school with a GED or some other kind of certification. We're only going to have time to scratch the surface of this issue today, so it's important to keep in mind how many different kinds of homelessness and how many different kinds of students we're talking about when we have this really broad conversation about Central Oregon's homeless students. So let's go ahead and jump into our program here and jump into our panel. Uriah, we're going to start with you. And folks, I will mention at the bottom of your screen there is some information on how you can send us questions. We will have time for a question and answer period at the conclusion or towards the end of our panel today. So go ahead and send us your questions, and we will be able to pose those to our panelists. So Uriah, let's go ahead and start with you. Hoping you can share your story about how you got to Southern Oregon University and what some of the key challenges that you faced in high school were.
I always struggled with confidence as a student. School was never really an important thing to me. It was from 8 to 3 every weekday. I barely got through my first year of high school when I was living with my family. And as you could imagine, when I moved out and I was living in the Loft for those 2 months, my motivation or care to do any kind of work disappeared completely. I got to SOU through the support of mentors and those around me, and largely kindred connections. The reason I didn't fall through the cracks of our homeless system was because I was seen as a person rather than a statistic.
And can you talk a little bit about graduation? Why was that so important to you? And what did graduating and graduation day and walking home with your diploma, what did that feel like? Why was that so important to you?
It truly kind of was the beginning of the rest of my life and let me walk away from the other struggles of the last 19 years and everything I faced in high school. It was truly that last chapter of the book or last page of the book that let me choose who I want to be. And yeah.
So, Steve, we talked about you're a teacher at Ben High and a graduation coach, but you're also a mentor to Uriah. So when did you meet him, and what was your relationship like?
So I first met Uriah at the end of his ninth grade year, which was a pretty rocky year. We were evaluating him for an individualized education plan, or an IEP. Ninth grade, 10th grade is usually pretty late for that process. So we did lots of testing with him. I got to spend some time with him. And then the morning of his meeting, I met with our school psychologist, Dr. Amy. And I said, so Amy, what are we really going to do for this guy? I didn't know him very well yet. Just really starting to get to know him. And so she said, I'm like, what are his goals going to be? What kind of services are going to help him do better? And he wasn't homeless at that point. And she said, well, Steve, he gets you. And I'm like, okay, great. It was a nice compliment. And really, I realized it wasn't about me, but he got a person. He got somebody looking out for him at high school. And that's what he needed. His ninth grade year, he wasn't really connected. It was a really rocky year. So that was when we first met. Then over the next few months, 10th grade, I realized that he wasn't super invested in high school yet. He told me he doesn't do homework, and he said it with a smile on his face. So I realized more and more that he needed a cheerleader. He didn't need math skills. He didn't need writing skills as much as he just needed to have a person on his side. So as we got to know each other, it must have been early spring, maybe, Brian knows, of 10th grade, he came and told me one day that his mom had told him that he needed a new place to live, which I'm not sure I'd ever experienced that before, having a kid tell me that. So he held himself together really well, and then we kind of embarked on our next journey together, which was not just about school, but about how are you going to survive as a teenager in this community.
Yeah, and so Uriah, what was that journey like for you when you find out that you're going to need to find a new place to live? What is your thought process at that point, and what is that process like for you to try and find a new place to live?
Panic. It's a lot of like, oh God, what am I going to do? I'm not an adult who has the skills to be able to contact all these people. But I had a cheerleader on my side, and I had people there to support me. It was a lot of asking around. I ended up talking to our school district's homeless liaison, who pointed me in a couple different directions, looking at a couple different programs. I think Kindred Connections and JBarJ and the Loft was the two really big ones we looked at. And it was phone calls here and there, filling out answer sheets, figuring out how I'm going to get my stuff out of my house. Ben Senior High School really supported me in a really positive way. Stephen Wetherald not only went with me to the Loft, but so did our vice principal, Gabe Pagano, just to sit down for an hour and a half. I think Eliza was there, just to talk about what their expectations for me are, how I can be helped, what their long-term kind of care looks like. But it was definitely a big and scary process, and it was just one more thing to add to the homework-life balance. And I wasn't a very good student, but it was just one more huge stressor in my life.
And you talked there about a couple different resources that were available, or a couple of different resources that you used. So you mentioned the homeless liaison. Maybe Steve, if you can tell us a little bit about, what is the presence of the homeless liaison in schools, and what is the importance, in particular, of the McKinney-Vento law, the federal law that deals with outlines how schools have to serve homeless students.
So I think I can talk about this a little bit, but Eliza probably knows more than I do. So we have, Ben LaPointe Schools has a homeless liaison, and they serve homeless youth in all of our schools. That sounds like an insurmountable job to me. because there's no way he or she could possibly know all of these students. They can definitely work with our fan advocates, which is our family access network, and help get resources out there. But for one person to manage that for the whole school district, it just isn't possible. And you can do the details of McKinney-Vento.
Yeah, absolutely. The homeless liaison role is really connected to the McKinney-Vento law. That it's pretty simple in that it mandates that a homeless student have access to school without some of the normal barriers that parents have to think about when they're enrolling a child in school. Things like having a birth certificate and immunization records available. Many times when a young person comes to a shelter or to a home where it's not their home, they're a homeless student, they don't have a birth certificate handy or a copy of their immunization card. And so it mandates that a school to enroll the student first and then try to get those things later. So that a child doesn't miss a whole lot of school in the process. It also allows for a child to keep attending a home school even if they have to move, even from a different town. So if we have a student who is homeless and they're living they're in Redmond High, and they come to a shelter in Bend, the school district would bus that student every day to their home school if the student wants to remain at the school. So that, in a lot of ways, has helped our students be able to graduate and continue on track from where they're at in school.
Yeah. And so what is the importance of that stability, a student being able to stay at the same school even if things in their life might be shifting around quite a bit? Why is that level of stability so important?
I think school provides really the only stability and structure that the youth may have at that point until they get other resources from the community. School is like a natural place for a child to receive, even a child who's not experiencing homelessness, to receive structure and safe and supportive adults. It's many times really the only connection that we have to that child, or that the school or anyone has to that child. That's really the stable place. I think that's why we saw, like during COVID and all the schools were shut down, when they opened back up, Child Protective Services and the schools were just overrun with the amount of like neglect and abuse and other things that had happened when schools were out of session, because really it's the only stable place for a child to be every day, and sometimes the only structure, whether they're houseless or not.
Well, and I think connecting it to Uriah and his story, I can't imagine if on that day he moved into the Loft, I can't imagine if he had to change schools on Monday, because he would have had to start over.
Yeah.
So he had two of his theater teachers were well connected. I was well connected, and so Monday morning he had a safe place to go where he knew he had people on his side. I just can't imagine walking into a new high school.
Yeah. I mean, Uriah, did that cross your mind that you might have to change schools? And what did it mean to be able to stay at Bend High instead of having to go to Summit or somewhere else?
It did cross my mind. I didn't think I was gonna be able to stay at Bend High, and I was ready to fight for it. And moving schools would have mean I would have lost Steven, who had helped me find a place to live, and I would have lost every other support network I had built for myself, and really displaced me and would have contributed to the struggle overall. I'm really glad I got to stay at Ben High. Ben High was a family for me. I remember doing my laundry there sometimes. It really was a kind, caring place. And I feel like I always have a family and a home there. And so being able to stay at Ben Senior High School was incredibly beneficial for all 4 years.
Yeah. And so you also mentioned the Loft. That's where you lived for a little bit of time. So Eliza, maybe let's toss it over to you. If you can tell us a little bit about what the Loft is and what role it's played in your own life and what role it plays in our community as well.
Yeah, the Loft is a program of JBARJ, and under JBARJ's umbrella, we have a continuum of services for homeless youth. Everywhere from like family mediation and runaway services, and emergency shelter, grandma's house. The Loft has been the longest, they've been a shelter in Central Oregon since 2002 when they opened, and really the need, it was really apparent that the need in the community was for longer term shelter for young people who just didn't have a safe and stable place to call home. So the Loft came about And we provide emergency shelter up to 21 days for children who are able to reunify with their parents. And that's really always the hope, that there is a safe place with the family to go. So we do a lot of mediation services out of the Loft. And when that isn't the case, we can provide shelter for a young person up to 24 months and sometimes longer than that. If a young person comes into the shelter at 16, they can, and we can, with the support of the community, we can extend the 24-month period with community support, like funding. We do life skills groups there, intensive case management, connections to resources, not just school, but things like mental health, drug and alcohol treatment, things like that. And the Loft really is near and dear to my heart and JBarJ as a whole, because I, like Uriah, lived at the Loft when I was a teenager. From the time I was 16 till I was 19, actually. And I was not an easy kid. And I went back 5 times to the Loft before I graduated the program. And really, I think that shows, like, I know that not every kid, the Loft isn't for everyone. And sometimes a young person needs more like a family environment. But in a lot of cases, when a young person comes to the Loft and they're able to get those independent living skills that aren't provided by the parents, it can make a huge impact on a young person's life. And I've seen it. I've worked for JBarJ off and on since 2008, and have seen clients that I worked with when I was a case manager at the Loft, who are now master's level social workers, a lawyer, paralegal, like different in these fields of just they're independent adults, they're parents. And I think really every young person deserves the stability and structure and just support that the school gives, that the Loft gives. And I think that's really why we do this work.
Yeah. And so, I'm really kind of curious about this cyclical relationship between education and homelessness. So what is the importance of education? We'll start with education of an individual student. What's the importance of a student finishing their education and getting their diploma? Particularly if they come from a background that is, has some of these instability factors, why is that so important for their future? Maybe let's start with Eliza.
Yeah, I think we know just it's pretty common knowledge that the more education someone has, the more likely they are to be like financially stable, and really education provides stability in a person's life. When I was a homeless youth, that was like my main goal and I had lots of people tell me I wouldn't graduate from high school. But then when I went to the Loft and they said, well, do you want to, I had dropped out by this time because I was homeless and living outside by myself. And when I went there, and I remember the caseworker sitting down with me and saying, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to get your GED? Do you want to go back to high school? And high school for me was always, that's where I heard about the Loft. I think school, not only does it provide stability and structure for a student, but, and those safe connections to adults, but it can really impact the rest of our lives when we're able to have that support and graduate high school. Really, we're better for it, and we're able to take on adulthood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Steve, from your perspective, when you're teaching students who face barriers, whatever the barriers are in their life, whether it's homelessness or something else going on, what is the importance of seeing that student across the graduation stage? I mean, when you see them succeed, what does that feel like to you, and why do you care so much about that?
The importance to me? Oh, well, yeah. So my favorite day of the school year is graduation. I love it. Sometimes the tears come. Sometimes they don't. Last year I had to read names, so I had to hold in all those emotions. I think it's a what's the word? It's a rite of passage in our culture, and we don't have a lot of those. And so I feel so bad for the student who doesn't make it to graduation, whether it's homelessness, whether it's whatever the barrier is. I just feel so bad for that kid when they get up the next morning and they look in the mirror, and they can't say I completed high school. There's the financial piece, we all know. Yeah, the more education you have, the more statistically, the more money you're going to earn. That's great. But just at a really basic level, It's so important to take this next step. And if you think about it, the first, if you're struggling in life outside of school and you need a recommendation for a job, who do kids ask?
Mm-hmm.
They ask us.
Mm-hmm.
So we're their first, references on job applications at McDonald's and whatever they're looking for. So if they're not connected to school, they're not going to have that piece.
And so what are the challenges that you face when you have a student who does face, like we said, whatever barriers they might face in their life? What are the challenges that you face in teaching that student? Because that's that's ostensibly your job, is to teach the student, but then all of these other things come into play. So what are the challenges that you face there as an educator?
Kids coming to school every day. It's really hard for us to teach kids if they're not at school every day, if they're hungry, if they're worried about where they're going to sleep. I mean, these are big things. There's little things too, like their friendships, their relationships with, romantic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Kids worry about all kinds of stuff. But if a kid's coming to school and they don't know where their next meal's coming from, other than the meal or two they get at school, they just aren't going to be able to focus on learning. It's not going to happen.
And Uriah, did you experience that? I mean, when you were looking for a new place to live and you were moving from place to place, how easy was it to focus on school at those points?
It was difficult when I had the overall stress of where am I gonna sleep in a week, and how am I gonna get there, and how am I gonna take care of myself. And it was a huge distraction and was 10 times more important to me than any assignment my math teacher could have given me at that point. And personally, I'm really fortunate and very thankful that I didn't have to struggle with that issue for very long. And it was 2 months that I lived in a homeless shelter before living with my folks for a while, for 2 years. But it was still definitely a huge struggle, especially for those 2 months of like, okay, I'm gonna go back home and it's gonna be pretty chaotic, and I don't think I'm gonna get any of my biology homework done.
Yeah, and I think that looking at Uriah, he's so resilient. And not every young person's that resilient.
Mm-hmm.
And not every young person has his communication skills, because when this all happened, he was open and honest with his teachers. And when you tell your math teacher that you just moved into the loft and life's really hard right now, they're going to be a little bit more patient, probably a lot more patient with you.
Right.
So Uriah came to us with some really solid skills already. There's just lots of really good stuff inside of him. And so he made it. He did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of young people don't have really the words or the know how to ask for those things that they need, because those are things that are supposed to be provided for them. I remember many times when I've explained to people like what it's like to be a homeless student, it's like when you're experiencing homelessness, those basic needs that we really take for granted a lot of the times, like food and a warm shower and a place to sleep, those are the things that a person has to think, or a young person has to be thinking about how they're going to get on their own, because they're not being provided for them. And so sometimes school, even though there's guaranteed food there, at the end of the day, you still have to find a place to sleep and where you're going to get dinner, and if you can shower for the next school day. It's a lot.
And I would add to that, all of those things are so important, but so is somebody saying good night to you.
Yes.
I love you. I'll see you in the morning.
Absolutely.
Just those basic things that all kids should have.
Yeah, they need.
Yeah.
And how important is, community education and visibility in that, in that context? I guess, are there spaces for people in the community who might not be a student's parents? Are there spaces for people in the community to kind of provide those, or at least lower the barriers and make it easier to come up and say, I'm having struggles? What's the importance of that, Eliza?
Well, I think that really the only thing between a young person who kind of falls through the cracks and a young person who gets help is a safe adult that they can talk to. I think that there's always room for us to be that safe adult for young people. And if we don't come across, homeless youth on a regular basis to be able to be a safe adult, I think there's always there's always a way that we can support students who are struggling or youth who are struggling, by being a host home, by volunteering with Kindred Connections or other organizations. I think that that's the most important thing that a young person can have, because they don't have it with their parents at that moment. They really need to have safe adults that they can get help from.
And Uriah, for you, I'm curious, what was that? I mean, was that a challenge for you to stand up and say about yourself, kind of apply this label to yourself and stand up and say, I am facing these challenges? Was that a challenge for you to do that and to go up to the adults in your life and ask for help?
Absolutely. It's there's a real stigma about being homeless in our society, and there's a huge stigma about not doing your homework, or at least for me, I didn't have the confidence of a student, and so not feeling confident in school as a student, talking to my teachers, and then having to go up to them and say, "Hey, I'm sleeping in a homeless shelter," is huge and really hard to get off your chest. I mean, it took me, I had known for about maybe a year before I had to move out, but I didn't tell Steven I needed to move out until maybe 4 or 5 months before, because it was hard for me to communicate. And Steven at that time for me was a really important person in my life, but it was hard for me to say that to anybody. There's just a huge stigma around it, and I think it's really important for the community to look at people who are struggling with homelessness as just individuals who need a little bit of help, rather than a million of the other conceptions they have of them.
And what, at that time for you, what more help would you have liked to receive from your community? What would have been, what would have made that easier, if there is a way to, make that easier?
Well, a really big fear for me, I didn't think I was going to get accepted into the Loft. I was told that they didn't have a lot of space. I think it's 18 beds that is there right now. Right, Eliza? Do you know the number?
Normally, there is, because of COVID, we were told that we had to take less youth. But
So
normally, yes.
More programs that are willing to help fill in the position of that are run by members who are qualified to, is really what I would have needed. Because if the Loft had said no, I don't know what I would have done. I would have had to apply to Kindred Connections or another organization, or I might have had to find a friend to sleep on their couch for a week and just keep applying. But our community is so big that you can't just depend on one location or one facility or program to take care of this huge issue.
And in your experience, Eliza, what are the gaps that you see and that you face, when you're trying to help as many youth as you can? Obviously, you can't help them all, but what are the gaps that you see and that you face?
Yeah, youth homelessness is on the rise. It's, in our last pit count, I think it was up 222% or something crazy.
And the pit is the federal point in time count
you.
that comes every year.
Yeah, so every year we are tasked with to count how many youth that we're working with, how many youth that we know of in the area. And this last year, we had a lot more than the previous years. And I think in part, that's that we did a better job counting them, because we know that homeless youth are hard to find, just because youth, they're not safe on the streets. So a lot of times they are couch surfing, like Uriah mentioned, or they're in school during the time that we count them. They're not camping in the bigger, larger homeless camps. They're kind of trying to find places away from people because they are more at risk. And some of the gaps that we really see in the community are obviously more shelter beds for homeless youth. But instead of JBarJ, deciding what those gaps are, we actually recently just was awarded a grant from the state of Oregon to do a community, kind of reach out to the community. I'm hoping Steve will help me with input as well, that when we do get it up and running, just to ask what the community feels like, what roles we can take on, and like how we can grow in the future in really a sustainable way, but also what the community wants to see from us. I know that we need more options for youth ages 18 to 24 that are outside of the adult systems, because we know developmentally youth need a different level of care than adults do. And it's really important that we really take a look at that, because someone like Uriah, he needs someone there with him all the time, and support long term, not just in the short term, because we know that like long term relationships are really important, and connections to the community are really important for youth.
And you mentioned a number of things there, the planning effort and the forward-looking effort, but also being a host home and other things. How can people get involved in that sort of thing? If someone sees this and says they want to do whatever, spend whatever extra time or resources they have, how can folks get involved?
We have a couple of different host home programs. Kinder Connections is great. They're also part of JBARJ, and they provide long-term shelter. A person can provide long-term shelter in their home with their family for a youth, and that's really any age. They serve even very young children. And that's like an alternative to like the foster care system, where a lot of times young people get involved in the foster care system because the parents can't take care of them. This is instead they're with a safe family who can provide mentorship with the family long term. And then also through Cascade Youth and Family Center, who works really closely with the Loft, part of the Loft, we have the host home model there, where instead of going to the Loft and being in a shelter, a young person can go into a family, and they actually will pay a stipend for the family to be able to care for the child. And we're hoping to do that like at a longer term. The state of Oregon is really wanting to provide funding. A bill just passed to be able to provide funding. We're hoping to get some funding from that. That the host home, instead of it being like a 21-day period, it could be a long-term option for youth, because we know that not every youth wants to live in a host home, but maybe the Loft is a better option for them. There has to be different avenues. There's not like a no wrong door approach for a young person.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think that Uriah and I were talking last week, and all of these kids are individuals.
Yeah.
And some Uriah needed a home.
Right.
He needed two people to really take care of him. And other people, that's not what they're looking for. I know a young lady that was at the Loft a few years ago for, I think, over 2 years. And she just needed a roof over her head and access to food so she could go to college.
Yeah.
So it really is dependent on the individual.
Absolutely.
And from your perspective, Steve, academically, are there gaps in the system that you wish you could provide for students who face barriers or students who experience homelessness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we know, if you're lucky enough to have a Kindred Connections family, they're going to be checking on you. They're going to check your grades. They're going to give you a space to do homework. At the Loft, they're going to check on you. But it just depends on where the kid is. And I think the schools need to provide more support with that, whether it's an after-school program, and I keep thinking about this, that isn't stigmatizing, right? It can't just be for kids experiencing homelessness. Otherwise, everybody would know that, and that would be really uncomfortable, I would think. But there should be good food and great staff and transportation, and it should be really easy for students to access.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about at time for questions from our audience, which I should have here in just a moment. So you should see the Menti code right at the top of your screen there. Feel free to send in more questions there. Okay, so we got a question. As a member of the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, I know how difficult it is to fund any housing, and I worry about how to house these vulnerable teens. Any suggestions on how to expand options? Start maybe over to Eliza to start.
Yes, I have a lot of opinions about this. I think that when we are building projects, we need to, it depends, right? So if we're building like a Housing Works project where we're getting some subsidy from the federal government so that it can be lower income, I think it would be really great. And Housing Works is actually partnered with us in Madras to provide some set-aside units. So what that means is if there's some open apartments, they'll call us first and say, hey, do you have any homeless students or students exiting the foster care system who need a place, need an apartment? And if we do have a youth that's ready to get into housing, then they would get first dibs on that apartment. I think it's really important also to look at education for landlords. We recently were just given a position that we're going to be posting for soon. So if anyone needs a job, keep an eye out for a Landlord Navigator. So that person is going to be specifically working with homeless youth and youth exiting the foster care system to look for apartments and to connect with landlords so that a young person can have a chance. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of barriers for young people, just not having credit. Obviously at the Loft, we try to write a letter and tell them, hey, they've been a great tenant here, but they don't have rental experience. So that's a great question. I think there's a lot of things as a community we can do. But if you have the power to give us set-asides, we would love them.
And that's interesting, the Landlord Navigator. I hadn't heard about that before, but one of the students I talked to, she said she'd applied for 25 different units, and she had a Housing Works grant, so she had the money. She just couldn't get an email back from any of the landlords.
Right. They look at the age and no history, and they just deny you.
And it's such a competitive housing market.
And so expensive.
It's so expensive.
So some of those affordable units really need to be set aside for young people.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we got another question here. I hosted a student that was kicked out of his home last winter. It was good to help, but I wasn't able to serve as his advocate for decisions. It was frustrating to not be able to help more. So, this idea of an advocate, a student needing an advocate, I think that kind of gets the heart of the comment here. And we've kind of talked on this, the importance of having that advocate. But
absolutely. I want to just mention, in a situation like that, if you're willing to become a host home and have that young person, connect that young person to like Cascade Youth and Family Center for mediation services and case management in the school and support, that's like a perfect example of like you're already providing shelter to this young person. Is it sustainable financially? If it's not, sometimes you can just become a host home and continue to host that student. So that they don't have to move on to another option if it's working for you and your family.
Yeah, that's when I read that question, I was thinking, I wonder how many students we have
Probably
that
a
are
lot.
doing that. I think it's more than we know.
Yeah.
But to connect with Cascade Youth and Family
Yeah.
and get that case management service, I mean that was a huge. I can't even tell you how big that was for Uriah.
what and that's kind of interesting, the division between that kind of formal host family program versus just living on a friend's couch or living on an extended aunt's couch or whatever the case may be. So what's the importance of having that formal relationship with the host home? What does that add?
I think having the formal relationship, but also the support. The host home has the support of Cascade and Family, and so does the youth. I think the importance is the stability for the young person, because when a young person is feeling like, can I do this for long term? Is this going to be something where they're going to tell me next week I can't live here anymore? It's really hard for them to focus on, like Uriah was saying, focusing on homework and school. If they don't know if this is, it's very uncomfortable. I know from experience, staying at someone's house, not knowing knowing you are going to be homeless if you have to leave. And then also, well, I'm not their kid. Can they afford to keep me?
Right.
They don't have to be homeless, like, on the street for us to put them in a host home. Sometimes those relationships have already been formed before we met them. And in a lot of other places in the state, other organizations like ours talk about that, like how sometimes that's the best thing. They already have a relationship, so why not support them in that relationship?
Yeah. We got another question here. For community members without personal connection to a houseless student, what's a takeaway from this conversation that we can do to practically help improve a student's academic and future success? I think I want to bring in Uriah here on this question. I mean, what are some of the key takeaways that you're getting here about what Bend community members or Central Oregon community members can do for our students here experiencing homelessness or houselessness?
Just like Eliza said earlier, to be a safe adult and to be kind and to be there to listen to them, and let them know that they're not going through it alone, because there's nothing more terrifying than staring at amount of paperwork thinking I have to do this all by myself and figure out where I'm going to go. So I think the community can just be, if they can be there to sit there and listen, and let the person know they're not alone, I think that is amazing and going to do an incredible amount of good.
You can also, obviously you can always donate to organizations like FAN and JBRJ. But also Big Brothers Big Sisters, we have a mentorship program to connect mentors with homeless youth. There's a lot of ways you can get involved if you don't have anyone in your life that you want to support. I know the FAN is always accepting donations. Mm-hmm. Same with the Loft and Grandma's House. We do a lot of incentives for the youth. And so gift cards or, pillowcases, anything really. But if you really want to impact a young person, you can always look into mentorship and other things like that.
Yeah, there are lots of organizations. COPY.
Yeah.
I can't remember what COPY stands for.
I have no idea.
But it's for youth with a parent in prison.
Oh yes,
And
that's
so
a great
it's
organization.
It's such a great one.
Yeah.
And the mentors are given more support than
Yeah.
some other organizations.
CASA. I mean, there's lots of.
CASA's wonderful.
Yeah.
And we mentioned a couple times FAN, but I don't think we fully explained what FAN is. So, Steve,
Yeah.
if you want to jump, or either of you, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the Family Access Network,
Yeah.
what they do here locally.
We're really fortunate in our region. So Family Access Network is in Crook, Jefferson, and Deschutes counties, and I believe they have someone in Warm Springs as well. And it's a nonprofit organization that works really closely with the schools and the homeless liaison to provide resources to families, whether a student is homeless or not, it doesn't matter, for things like food, school clothes. I've even heard of them helping fix someone's car before, gas vouchers. They do so much mentorship with the families. And I had a FAN advocate when I was a homeless student, and she used to give me things like menstrual products. I mean, they really just support you in anything that you need. They're amazing.
Yeah, and their mission is to remove barriers.
Yeah.
Right, so that students can go to school and can focus on their studies and improving their lives.
Yeah, they do such great work.
They're wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And our next question here, do we need another space like the Loft or Bethlehem Inn, but dedicated only to students? Anybody have strong feelings about this?
I was going to say yes.
Yes, I think we need shelters in every community, because right now we'll have students from Jefferson County or Redmond that have to come all the way to Bend for shelter. So I think that we could use more shelter in Bend. I think we could use one in Redmond. I think we should just give every community a shelter, and they would be used.
And as a community, we talk a lot about shelters and homelessness, like capital H homelessness generally. But what's the importance between the division focusing on specifically the needs of youth rather than just, let's build more homeless shelters?
Right.
What's the division?
Yeah, youth. Well, when we're talking about operating a homeless shelter for youth, it's so much more difficult than an adult shelter, because we have things like staff ratios. You have to have a certain amount of staff for every youth. You have to be licensed. There's so many things. The importance of providing youth-specific services for street outreach, for really any kind of services, is that it's developmentally appropriate services. We are trained in trauma-informed care. We're trained really to look at the young person. They're not making, no one, I don't believe anyone makes a choice to be homeless. But a young person really comes about it in a way of, it happens to them, really. A lot of people who are experiencing homelessness, it happens to them. And so these young people really need support and like age appropriate services. They don't work within the adult system. I talk about that a lot. Like, we're kind of working to support these youth in a system that's made for adults.
And I think I think this is a good question for Steve here. This one says, I'm a teacher. I'm restricted from some things, but what more could I do with the school district and within the school district to help those students?
That's your question.
That's my question. Okay. So as a teacher, I think it's that connection piece. It's so hard for especially high school teachers. They see, up to 200 kids during the week, but to really notice those kids who are struggling. It's like, okay, Johnny's attendance is poor and his grades are poor, but like, instead of just thinking Johnny's lazy, like, why can't Johnny get his homework done?
Yeah.
Why is he always, why is this, a teacher told me yesterday, well, this kid, his head's always down and he is sound asleep. So is he sound asleep because he's playing video games all night? Very possible. Or is he sound asleep because he sleeps on a couch with, 3 people in a household? And so I just think getting to know your students, I think that's the biggest thing. And for Uriah, I think that was so important to him.
Yeah, that's trauma-informed care. We're informing ourselves, like, what is associated. It's not just behavior.
No.
A young person, we don't see anger and sadness and missing school because because a young person is just wanting to slack off.
Right. And
There's a
sometimes
lot
they
of
do
other-
want to slack
Yes,
off. And that's
yes.
okay because they're teenagers.
Right.
And they're supposed to
Right.
do that sometimes.
Yeah.
But we need to dig a little deeper and
Yeah.
figure out what's really going on.
I love that
Going
you said
in-
that the other day.
Oh, sorry.
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say, going into a class and just having that warm, welcoming smile of a teacher who I know legitimately cares about me and wants me to do good was incredible and really helped get me through high school as a whole. And yeah, they're teenagers, so they're not always going to be happy, and that's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. And that is so incredible and so helpful and really helped get me through the 2 months I was living at the Loft, is going into my history teacher's office or room and just having him sit down and talk to me and ask me how I am legitimately, and letting me be honest and communicate how I feel.
Yeah, you're right. I think at a really basic level, I was speaking to the staff a few weeks ago, and somebody asked me if you could have teachers do one thing this year, what would it be? And this year is such a weird year. It's really difficult for everybody. But I said, I want every kid to hear a teacher say their name 5 times a day. So every time you walk into a classroom, your teacher should say, "Good morning, Uriah." Just that little piece.
Yeah.
To start feeling connected again. And that's for all
So
kids.
important. That's really important.
Yeah.
Well, I'm getting the sense here from our questions that we've got a lot of folks in the audience who really want to help.
That's great.
And so this person asks, I want to help more, but as a single adult, bringing a child into my home comes with other challenges. Where might this person fit into this system of services that doesn't exist?
I have an answer.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
So as a single person, as a single adult, 14 years ago, I had a student who was struggling, and I was approached by juvenile justice if I would like to be a foster parent. And as a single adult, it's like, wow, that's a big lifestyle change. And I said yes. And it was a great experience for a year and a half, and we are still well connected. He's 25 years old now. He's done with college. But it's a really big decision. And, being a Kindred Connections family is a big decision. Being a foster parent is a big decision. But it's there. I mean, if you have that inside of you, and if you have that much to give, please give it. Like you were talking, you can make donations.
Yeah.
You can be a big brother, big sister. There's lots of
Volunteering.
other steps in that system that are so helpful as well.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we're about at the end of our program here. So thanks so much for your questions, folks. Really appreciate your time and your focus here on this issue. I am going to toss it back to City Club Executive Director Kim Gammond here. Thanks again so much for your time and your interest and engagement on this issue. And I invite you to continue following the Bulletin's continued coverage on this issue. Kim, over to you.
Wow, that was incredible and that was powerful. And I hope our community members that are watching live and those that can watch it going forward have a lot of takeaways there. So thank you to the Bulletin for partnering with us on this project. I think you can tell from the conversation today, it really helped bring us to another level. There's so much more to get into, but we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're done for today, but the conversation is not over. In 2 weeks, we'll meet with many of you for another discussion about how we can put solutions in motion for Central Oregon's homeless youth. This will be the first of many solutions workshops co-hosted by the Bulletin and the City Club of Central Oregon. We look forward to continuing the conversation, and we invite you to follow the continuing coverage in the Bulletin. City Club sends a survey after every forum to get your feedback, so we can help shape events in the ways that work for our audience. Please be sure to fill out today's survey. The anonymous results are shared with our committees and our board. And then remember, if you enjoyed today's forum, to help support City Club, please consider being a member or a live stream sponsor, and you can do that at cityclubco.org. We are also currently seeking committee members for 2022, so please feel free to contact me to learn more about how to become involved. And then finally, we have a fun announcement. On November 18th, City Club will be returning in person for a limited audience for the first time in almost 2 years. We will also continue to offer our live stream for free. Please check your email next week for more information on this November forum, which is called The Seeds of Civility, Moving from Civil Frustration to Community Participation. Thank you for watching. Please continue to cultivate conversation about issues that connect us all to build a strong community.